All right. It is 3:31, so we will get started, and some more folks will be joining us, I'm sure. But welcome to our first idea lecture of 2021, which clearly is proving itself to be a very exciting year, hopefully in a little lighter fashion than last year. But um, obviously, with everything going on in the Capitol right now, we will be mindful of the moment and honor everybody's time and make sure that we have an opportunity to have some good discussion with our speaker today. As always, the idea lecture seems to fall on a very important day and recognize a really important moment. So I'm glad that y'all are joining us today amidst everything going on. My name is Celeste Green. I am one of the third-year OBGYN residents. And I'm excited to welcome you to this lecture series, the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Advocacy Lecture Series. Our speaker today is someone very near and dear to my heart, and also a highly accomplished writer, actor, and scholar. This is Dr. Nikita Hamilton. Oh, let me see if my slides here work. Perfect. Dr. Hamilton is, as I said, a writer and actor, a comedian, and she has the unique experience of existing at the intersection of industry and academia. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Pennsylvania and then later moved to Los Angeles to attend University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. There she earned her master's and doctorate in communication. Her research and her studies at USC focused on representations of Black women in television, culture, and gender. And it was toward the end of her studies that Dr. Hamilton recognized she wanted to write for television and not just write about it. So with that decision, she landed a position as a writer's assistant for the second season of FX's acclaimed series Atlanta. If you haven't seen it, please check it out, which not only gave her a crash course in comedy writing, but also solidified that creating engaging shows was what she wanted to do with her life and through her work. So since then, she's written, co-produced, and starred in a short film called Call Out Black, which received the Dolores Huerta Award given to a female filmmaker creating work designed to progressively impact society. And that was awarded at the Long Beach Indie Film Festival the year the film was released. She wrote on the fourth season of Freeform's The Bold Type, recently co-created, wrote for, and starred in a comedy web series called Best Friends, and currently is a staff writer on ABC's A Million Little Things. So if you don't know of her work yet, then get familiar. And today you'll get a little taste of some of her incredible wisdom, and she has a lot to share with us about television, Black representations, and what they mean for Black lives. So I'm very, very excited to hand the floor over to Dr. Hamilton. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can take over. And then if questions come up throughout the lecture, please go ahead and share them in the chat. I'll be taking a look at that, and we can moderate some Q&A afterwards when Dr. Hamilton's finished with her lecture, but she may reach out and ask for some participation, so just get ready.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you all can see this. Can you see the slides? Is it full screen for you all? Awesome. Okay, so I titled this talk, How They See Us, Television, Black Representations, and What They Mean for Black Lives. And I guess the little asterisk on it would also be for medical professionals' lives. I'm hoping that you come out of this with a good sense of what a lot of your patients are coming to you thinking in their heads about doctors and medicine. So I first want to talk about my own journey into television. So I wanted to explain to you all how I ended up a TV writer. I had a very roundabout but useful journey to television. During the summer of 2008, I interned for a fashion stylist. I thought I wanted to go into fashion. And he said that I was the Louise to his Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, the movie. I did not find this to be a compliment in the slightest. And but I didn't have the language for why this was bothersome. Sure, Jennifer Hudson's character was Carrie's assistant, just like I was his, but the relationship between those two characters felt more weighted. It felt unfair and a little wrong, despite the pleasantries exchanged between them. When he said I was the Anne Hathaway to his Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada, which it has its own set of problems, that comparison felt a little bit better. Hathaway's character ended up with a good job that she wanted and a bunch of great Chanel items. When I went home for Christmas break, your own Dr. Green, her big sister Madison, and I were playing Sex in the City, the board game. And we got to talking about Jennifer Hudson's character. It bothered them just as much as it bothered me. Louise had to solve everything for Carrie, and she was so happy about it, all the while just because she was from St. Louis and getting to live the New York life. Why was this Black character being used this way? Why could we all name more Black characters that had been utilized in the same exact manner? We were touching on the issue of stereotypes and more specifically negative racial stereotypes without really even knowing it. When I got back to school, I asked to do an independent study about the evolution of the magical Negro, once I figured out that that description actually fit Hudson's character. That research and some encouragement from a friend led me to applying to PhD programs where I could continue to not only study negative stereotypes, but also learn how to interrogate the ways that these stereotypes affected us in real life. I knew that for some people in this country, those images were the only images of Black people they'd seen, that they'd gotten to actually interact with. I wanted to know what these tropes meant for Black Americans countrywide and worldwide, since entertainment is one of the United States' biggest exports. I left for USC ready to tackle this topic, but by the time I had my qualifying exams in 2015, I was asking myself if academia was really for me and decided that it wasn't. I didn't want to teach about television, I wanted to make it. I began not only pivoting my career path, but also thought about how my dissertation could help me make an inroads into the television industry. I spent much of 2016 trying to get a full-time job in entertainment, but it's kind of hard to get an assistant job when you have PhD in progress on your resume, apparently. Eventually, I was hired to be the writer's assistant on season 2 of the show Atlanta and have been in the industry ever since. I defended my dissertation in 2017, became the showrunner's assistant on the freeform show The Bold Type, and got my first credit writing on it in season 3. I was promoted to staff writer for season 4, and now I'm a writer on ABC's A Million Little Things. I often get asked if my PhD has helped me with writing for television, and honestly, it hasn't. However, it has helped me think about and discuss the characters I write, as well as influence the thoughts and ideas I contribute to the shows on which I work. I know what the stereotypes are not only for Black characters, but also Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous ones. I know the boxes that marginalized characters are often put into, and alarm bells go off anytime someone attempts to make one of us one-dimensional or purely for the service of white characters. I have worked to expand those alarm bells to include the LGBTQIA, disabled, and neuroatypical communities. And I know that the work never stops and that there will never be a point at which I know everything, because that's just impossible. So I'd first like to walk you through representation through the lens of academia, the very first lens I saw it through. In 1944, Lawrence Riddick, an African-American historian and professor who wrote the first biography of Martin Luther King Jr., wrote, "The movie, radio, newspaper, and library are of the most important agencies for the communication of information and ideas in American society." Yvonne Sims wrote that as a cultural artifact, film has the power to shape, reinforce, and change cultural perceptions about ethnicities, gender, class, and sexuality. In her book, Women of Blaxploitation, how the Black action film heroine changed American pop culture. In my opinion, television is even more powerful. I don't think either of those scholars could have envisioned the average American household's traditional television watch time reaching almost 9 hours a day from 2009 to 2010. This chart from Nielsen shows numbers beginning in 1949 all the way to May of 2017. In 2016, the average American's traditional TV watch time was 5 hours and 4 minutes a day. Your Netflix, your Prime, your Hulu, your HBO Max now, and your Peacock and your Disney Plus and whatever else they're getting ready to charge us all $8 to $18 for in the near future, is here. In 2018, Nielsen reported Netflix users spent 52 billion minutes streaming the show The Office. And if you take that number, they said it was actually probably low because of the mechanism through which they were counting it. So that number equates to every single subscriber on Netflix at the time watching 42 episodes of The Office. Television is a force. Television is an influence. And it's great when it's being used for good, but it's not so great when it's reinforcing stereotypes that were engendered to keep marginalized people in their place. So in Donald Bogle's seminal text, Toms, Coons, Mammies, Mulattoes, and Bucks, he lays out the history of Blacks in American films. All of these characters were used to entertain white audiences and to stress Negro inferiority. At their beginnings, and some of them were portrayed by white actors in blackface. These definitions can be found in much greater detail in his book if you're ever interested, but I'm going to go over some of them briefly. The Tom, also known as the Uncle Tom, was the first in a long line of good Negro characters. No matter what is done to the Uncle Tom, he keeps the faith and he never turns against his white master. He is submissive, stoic, generous, and endeared to white audiences. The Coon presented an amusement object, a black buffoon, and came in three forms: the Pickaninny, the Prayer Coon, and the Uncle Remus. The Pickaninny gave the Negro child actor a place in films. He or she is harmless, a little screwball, and their hair often stood on end. The evil version was recently seen in Lovecraft Country's Mopsy and Topsy. The Pure Coon was unreliable, lazy, subhuman, and did nothing but eat watermelon, steal, and butcher the English language. The Uncle Remus was harmless and congenial, a kind of first cousin to the Uncle Tom. He was used to indicate the Black man's contentment with the system and place he was in. Or should I say, he was used to convince white audiences that Black people were content in the system in which they were placed in. The Buck was first introduced in D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. The Buck can be divided into two groups, the Black Brute and the Black Buck. The Black Brute was barbaric and raised as hell. They're physically violent, sexually repressed, making them feral and a danger to white people generally. The Black Buck is big, bad, and he's oversexed and violent and particularly dangerous to white women. In Birth of a Nation, a white woman flings herself off of a cliff rather than to be taken by a Black Brute, who in the movie itself only has a card that says, he said, "You see, I'm a captain now and I want to marry, and wait, Missy, I won't hurt you." The Mammy was created as a defense of slavery. The Mammy was happily obedient, docile, loyal, protective, and the antithesis of her white mistress. She was never portrayed in a sexual light because she would have been a threat to her mistress. She was an asexual figure who invited an ambiguous resolution of sexual tensions. In addition, when it came to her own family, the Mammy was in control, indicating that Blacks had their family structure backwards and could not make it on their own and needed slavery to survive. The mulatto, or the tragic mulatto, is a figure that experienced the plight of having a drop of Black blood that ruins their lives. She was made likable or sympathetic, likely due to her own white blood, and audiences were meant to feel that she could have been so happy and productive if only she hadn't been the victim of her racial inheritance. The Jezebel, the bad Black girl and hypersexual temptress, she's promiscuous and she has an insatiable sexual appetite. She mesmerizes men and she lures them into her bed for a purpose of getting something of value from them. That's Robin Givens' character in Boomerang. The trope was used to excuse the behavior of white male slave owners and to provide an explanation for mulatto offspring. These women weren't to be trusted because how could anyone who is unchaste be trustworthy? The Jezebel exists to reify the notion that Black women are hypersexual and our credibility is always in doubt. There is also the trope of the sapphire slash angry Black woman who is kind of a sassy mammy who berates her husband or the men in her life and children and just about anybody, and they can get away with it. Gabrielle Union's character in Deliver Us from Eva, where she's Eva and evil, is a perfect example. Sapphire's attitudes and the lack of punishment for it, Black men characters at the time could never get away with such commentary, were supposed to imply that slavery and segregation weren't overly oppressive. Sapphires had been accepted by their white families that they worked for. The title, The Sapphire, comes from the character of Sapphire Stevens in the Amos and Andy radio show, which aired from 1928 all the way to 1960 and was basically a minstrel show that helped teach Americans that Blacks were ignorant and comical as a race, and that some Black women were just emasculating and mean. The magical Negro is a character that appears solely to help a white character, and once they're done, poof, they're gone. Whoopi Goldberg's character is so magical and ghost that she can be possessed. And as Ida Mae Brown, some magical Negroes are also actually magic, like Will Smith's character appearing out of nowhere in The Legend of Bagger Vance to caddy and hold Matt Damon's golf bag and hand emotionally through a tournament. The audience doesn't get to know magical Negroes most of the time because they're only there to serve one purpose, getting the main white character to where they need to be. There are also other tropes like the welfare queen and the strong Black woman, as well as others. So these same tropes from film are perpetuated on television. JJ on Good Times is a coon. His mother, Florida, was a mix of the mammy and mainstream matriarch stereotypes. We find the sapphire stereotype in Cookie from Empire and even Molly from Insecure. Why are you so mad all the time, Molly? So now you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with us? Great question. Fantastic question, actually. It has to do with you because when people are given little to no interaction with marginalized people or groups, they utilize what they see on television to define them. They try to place these tropes onto Black people in real life. Michelle Obama and Serena Williams have both found themselves characterized as sapphires in the media, that they're angry, that they're emasculating, that they're the antithesis of what it means to be a lady, none of which is true. These women are smart, they're assertive, and they recognize the respect they should hold in their respective fields. Sometimes the grafting of harmful stereotypes isn't even done intentionally or with malice, but with a disconscious racism, which I will discuss in a couple of slides. Here we see the brute was personified with this Vogue cover of LeBron James and Gisele Bündchen. Was it purposeful? Unlikely, but it was still done. Television images along the lines of race, gender, and occupation will affect how people interact with you as Black, as Indigenous, as people of color, as men, as women, as gender nonconforming, and as medical professionals. You have to remember that people who have been watching TV have been interacting with it for much longer than they've been coming to see you. Some of your patients feel closer to Dr. Gregory House, Dr. Miranda Bailey, Nurse Jackie, Dr. AJ Austin, and Nurse April Sexton than they do to you, and understanding why that is and what that means can only help you as medical professionals. Now I'm going to pivot for a second to tell you about my dissertation. The aim of my dissertation was to examine the relationship between disruptions to the television ecology and the negotiations that Black women engage in when dealing with representations of Black women on television. The reason why I'm going to tell you about it is because understanding how some of your patients interact with TV images and the workers behind the scenes can only hopefully be more helpful to you. Stereotypes are not simply injected into us and automatically believed, as the hypodermic needle model, also known as the magic bullet theory, once proposed. Christine Glenhill's framework of negotiation was integral to this project, in addition to interviews I conducted with Black female executives and Black female audience members. So I could interrogate how these women negotiated with the images of Black women on television in that particular era of disruption to the television ecology. And by doing this, I uncovered a bit more than what some scholars assumed would be a simple desire for more and better representations. What I uncovered through my analyses of these interviews were nuanced negotiations conducted by Black women on multiple levels within different components that had yet to be directly examined. But I'm sure more have been looked at now because I wrote this in 2017 and time flies when you're being stereotyped. What I also found interesting was that these analyses also reinforced arguments for the need to invest in TV as a continuing site for struggles over representation, visibility, and the capacity of representations to empower the marginalized generally, and Black women more specifically, due to their own readings of the text. Television shows like Scandal and Being Mary Jane, as well as more recent shows such as Insecure, were all a part of the rise in the number of Black female leads. This particular phenomenon mattered not only because television is a powerful cultural tool and Black women are one of the most marginalized groups in America, but also because my examination of this phenomenon interrogates the negotiations or the give and take with representations that Black women engage in, presenting communication and cultural studies scholars with a marginalized group that understands that they are operating within a neoliberal system, regardless of whether or not they can label it as such, and can comprehend the influence of Black female images on society while placing added value to their own entertainment and empowerment. We know what these images can do, but our own entertainment and empowerment through and from these images seem to be of the most value to these women. My dissertation research questions. So the first one was, how have disruptions to the television ecology resulted in opportunities for Black American women to negotiate to have more Black women on screen in leading roles? Next, how and why do these disruptions take place? How do Black women audience members currently negotiate with the representations of Black women leads on TV? And then my overarching question, how have disruptions to the television ecology resulted in opportunities for Black American women to negotiate to make Black women more visible? So the first part of my research approach was utilizing Christine Glenhill's framework for negotiation. It doesn't have an overly deterministic view of cultural production, and it allowed me to make an examination of the give and take that happens between each component plane of negotiation. She defines negotiation as the ongoing process of give and take that arises from grappling between competing frames of reference, motivation, and knowledge. Negotiation positions cultural exchange as crossing of the processes of production and reception. In this framework, Glenhill posits three components of negotiation, which are institutional, textual, and reception. Institutional negotiations give and take between the needs of the media industries and user groups, as well as negotiation within media industries. Textual negotiations, technical, formal, and ideological negotiations in mainstream media texts. That's where I live now as a writer. Reception is negotiation, the viewing or reading of the audience influenced by their personal histories, cultural ideologies, etc. Here's the way I organize Glenhill's framework with Black women executives and Black women audience members. You see negotiation, then we go to the institutional, textual, and reception. And then under each of them, we see where the two groups that I interviewed fit. Now that group under textual, Black women creators and writers, is now where I live. And then under that, those things also can still be looked at by Black women executives and Black women audience members. So my second research approach, I focus on the concept of disruption because it makes negotiation more visible. I align disruption, which Clayton Christensen defines as the appearance of something that brings a very different value proposition to the market and has a tendency to upend established products completely or cause instability, alongside Raymond Williams' concept of the emergent. The emergent encompasses new meanings, values, and practices that represent human experiences, aspirations, and achievement that the dominant culture undervalues, oppresses, neglects, or just cannot recognize. I considered three types of disruptions when I was coming up with this project: technological, economic, and societal, since they best covered many things that affect the TV ecology. For example, political disruptions exist, but could be categorized under one of the three disruptions selected, such as how the FCC and its rulings on net neutrality fall under the technological because of the use of the internet for streaming services, for example. When I considered disruption, I moved from history to contemporary by looking at two critical cases of disruption: 1990 to 1995, and 2010 to 2015. Both cases included major race-based incidents in America, and both contained technologies that had greatly impacted television watching, as well as the distribution, exhibition, and both included the acknowledgement of Black buying power. So from 1990 to 1995, we see the rise of cable television, the Rodney King beating, and the introduction of the Fox network and a lot of Black TV shows. And then from 2010 to 2015, there's a rise of the internet and its platforms like YouTube. And then we have Trayvon Martin and the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the rise of Black spending power, because I believe at the time, the estimate was that by 2017, Black buying power is going to reach about 1.2 to 1.4 trillion dollars. Okay, so in the latter case, which continues today, it's unique because of the disruptive force of the internet and its platforms. So now for what I considered the really fun part of this project for me, because I just like talking to people sometimes. I conducted 7 one-on-one interviews with Black female executives and 4 small group interviews with Black female audience members from the coveted demographic of 18 to 49 years old, for a total of 18 audience members. Negotiation takes place both individually and collectively on each component or plane. So I decided to start with the people who have the most leverage regarding representation, the executives. These women were executives in broadcast, cable, and streaming television, like Channing Dungey, who was the first Black American president of a major broadcast network when she was promoted at ABC, and most recently became the chairwoman of Warner Brothers Television Group. And Ni Abong, who recently became the VP of overall deals at Netflix and was once the SVP of drama development at ABC Studios. These Black female executives are in unique positions to influence and also play a role of the cultural intermediaries, since they attempt to imbue goods and services with particular cultural meanings on representations. These women are creative executives, meaning they hear show pitches, they make decisions about which shows will have pilots made, partake in the script review and approval processes, and more. From my analysis, I gathered that the executives worked within what I titled a landscape of disconscious racism, with different levels that they operate on: peers and upstream, creators and downstream, advertising and sales. So disconscious racism is an uncritical habit of the mind that justifies inequity and exploitation by accepting the existing order of things. That's just how it is. It's a form of racism that tacitly accepts dominant white norms and privileges. It is not the absence of consciousness, but the impairment of it. I found that the executives described the use of technology for negotiation more heavily with peers and upstream. From the perspective of executives, the problem of the internet and its platforms have caused is further fragmentation of the audience. There's so many places for audience members to go now to watch television that once just didn't exist. However, the internet and its platforms have caused the call for better storytelling and more innovative stories, which executives use to their advantage in negotiating for certain shows. So for example, at the time, one of the executives I spoke to said, Issa Rae was always a good writer, a good creator, but her having her web series be so successful on YouTube allowed them to make arguments in favor of her show being purchased at certain studios. So the internet kind of gave them a negotiating tool, because Issa was able to use that platform to exhibit her work and get her foot in the door at a more traditional network. The themes of individuality and impact of real life emerge from the analysis of Black female audience interviews. Within the theme of individuality, the women were describing negotiating within themselves when dealing with representations of Black women on screen. They experience entertainment, empowerment, dislike, and an array of other feelings and thoughts from different aspects of different characters. There's no simple description of a character as she's good and she's bad anymore. These audience members articulated nuanced negotiations with Black female leads that they are currently watching on TV. Regarding the second theme, they have an understanding of the influence of their mediated images on society, but this does not deter the positive aspects that they are able to draw from Black female representations. Sure, they recognize that some of these images are a bit stereotypical, but it doesn't take away from the joy that they have of watching Cookie in Empire get into an argument with someone. So, technological disruption has provided Black women executives with a negotiating tool they use most prominently with their peers in upstream in order to influence and increase the number of people of color on television. They also negotiate with creatives and downstream and advertising and sales to increase people of color in front of and behind the screen. They see this as part of their purpose, and they understand that many people they work with either don't agree or don't take diversity into consideration when making decisions. Black women audience members negotiate with representations on an individual level in addition to considering them collectively. They identify with, appreciate, and dislike particular characteristics of Black women leads because of their individual histories and experiences, as well as their roles as Black women. They have an understanding of the influence of representations of Black women on both outside and inside of the Black community, and view themselves as outside of that influence. They acknowledge the presence of their double consciousness, but still draw pleasure from some of the images they believe reinforce negative stereotypes that they detest. The claim that Black women's negotiations, this nuance, are a more recent appearance cannot be concretely made, but a link between the increase in the amount of Black women characters that are complex and multifaceted and nuanced negotiations can be drawn. So, for example, a study was done using the show Dallas and speaking to white women about what they thought about those characters, how they negotiated with them, and they were having much more nuanced conversations about those characters in the 80s than Black women were about characters in the 80s that were Black. Now, what I was seeing was the same level of nuanced conversation in the late, 2010s, but there's no direct correlation that I could make from those studies, just because nothing was conducted with Black women at the time for me to compare it to. Talking to Black women and not treating them like a monolith matters because communication and cultural studies scholars can continue to examine how they are negotiating with all planes of television ecology as both individuals and as part of a collective, with disruptions sometimes providing them with more easily observable opportunities for their negotiations with representations to change and shift. Black women's wants from representation of Black women are neither simple nor static. So now I want to return to representation through the lens of academia, but a medical edition. For my dissertation, we can draw that executives, as well as writers and directors, make negotiations that it will eventually lead to the images and messages presented on screen. Audience members then negotiate with what they're receiving. So doctors' shows with physicians as central characters have long peppered television. I remember watching reruns of MASH as a kid, seeing commercials for ER and Chicago Hope, occasionally catching the always annoyed Dr. Becker, sneakily watching Nip Tuck, which I should not have been watching, and becoming caught up on the dramatic lives of the residents and doctors on Grey's Anatomy, which is now in its 17th season. Representations of you all make for good TV, and that TV affects patients' beliefs, expectations, and interactions with you all in the real world. In his book, Playing Doctor, Television, Storytelling, and Medical Power, Dr. Joseph Turow, who I had the pleasure of taking class with as an undergrad, wrote, "The parade of doctor images across the primetime stage therefore presents a pool of powerful images from which Americans draw their understanding of healthcare. In addition, the drama's compelling presentations of contemporary issues may mix with the news and personal experience in shaping people's reactions to policy discussions about the organization of healthcare in society." In the same book, Turow argues that there was a formula for early doctor shows in the 1950s and 60s that reinforced the positive public image of physicians, Dr. Kildare being a perfect example. The characters tended to be young, male physicians, his mentor, also male, a patient, and assorted other doctors, nurses, and orderlies. The physician healers were mostly specialists. In addition, they were rulers of their hospital. Medical administrators who worried about the cost of care were either absent or irrelevant. The central plot of each episode revolved around the patient's condition and was typically a combination of physical problems and emotional or social difficulties. The physical disorders were almost always acute rather than chronic. This allowed the plot to climax toward the end of each episode in a dramatic incident, usually an operation, that cured the patient or rarely led to death. Richard Mamsheimer's analysis in Doctors Only, The Evolving Image of the American Physician, shows that the show started broadening the image of the television doctor to include the psychosocial. Television's most popular doctors have appeared in several varieties, yet they share the same core ideals and familiar characteristics. Seen far more often than the average viewer's own physician, these electronic doctors work in a world of medical care far surpassing anything in real life. They usually save lives with ease, mend marriages, reconcile alienated families, give patients the will to live, and continuously reassert the primacy of the doctor-patient relationship. Meredith Grey is the doctor we all want. She's skilled, she cares, she has a best friend, just like us. They dance it out, they go for drinks, and their conversations always inform how she connects with the patients. She understands love and knows what it means to fight for it, just like she fights for her patients every single episode, day. Now, doctor shows have clearly expanded, not to include medical personnel, but expanded as far as stepping outside of the perfect people box that they used to be in. Doctors and nurses on these shows can also be flawed. Very, very flawed. The backstage to these doctors' lives are a major parts of these television shows, and they include addiction, adultery, failure, and more. They're not all selfless heroes, but layered human beings who entertain and leave audience members thinking you all have some interesting lives and can get things done and done correctly in about an hour. What does this mean for you in the real world? One study had results that demonstrated that heavy viewers of Grey's Anatomy perceived this program to be credible, and that credibility was positively associated with the perception of real-world doctors being courageous. The direct association didn't emerge between Grey's Anatomy viewing and that perception of doctors being courageous, but the indirect effect emerged mediated through credibility. The more your patients watch Grey's Anatomy, the more courageous they think you are. So heavy TV users, which many Americans are, negotiate with these images and they influence their perceptions of you. Now, representation through the lens of industry is a little different. As a writer, my job is to help tell a story, an entertaining story. And though many aspects of real life are entertaining, there's a reason the case of the day isn't gallstones, unless it's a 5-pound gallstone. And yes, I do want someone to tell me if that's possible later because I'm working on a new sample script. So just keep that in mind. More and more television creators are recognizing that the shows they make should look like the real world. And here's a clip from 911 Lone Star.
Who'd you call this time, you crazy lady?
You better call the police. That man is unstable.
I'm unstable? You're unstable.
Oh, I think we have a misunderstanding.
No, I don't misunderstand anything. She may look like a sweet old lady, but she's an evil racist.
Who you calling old?
Really? That's the part that upset you?
I am not a racist. My gardener is Spanish.
She called the cops on us last week on my daughter's 10th birthday.
They were waving around a bat.
At a piñata, you twisted vieja.
Yes, I called the police, and I'm going to keep calling until somebody does something.
You know what? You don't have to call the police anymore because I'm making a citizen's arrest.
Oh, good.
Put your hands behind your back.
What? Me?
TK, get the cuffs? We don't have any cuffs, Cap.
Oh, I'm sure we could find some zip ties.
No, that'll work just fine.
Proby. Wait, now hold on. I'm an American citizen.
Which is why you should know that making a nuisance 911 call is against the law. Paul, call APD. Tell them we're on our way down.
Yup.
Boom.
Ma'am?
Uh-oh.
Ma'am?
My heart.
Ma'am, are you all right? Captain,
Dear
you can't take her to
Jesus.
jail. She's having a heart attack.
I know. Arjan, take her BP.
On it, Cap.
Maybe give her some mouth-to-mouth.
No, not her.
So maybe you're not having a heart attack?
I am. I definitely am. Can't you do it?
Not certified.
Oh, how about him?
Sure, ma'am, but just so you know, I am a homosexual.
Oh,
No.
he can do it. I told you I am not a racist. You're not a homosexual, are you?
Oh, no, ma'am.
But I am trans, though.
Take me to jail.
So there you go. Ooh, next slide. So creatives are also showing the ways that medical professionals are dealing with sexism, racism, xenophobia, and more in their lives. Here's an example from Grey's Anatomy.
Plans, please. Can't operate. I won't sign the consent form.
You need the surgery. You will die without the surgery. You may die with the surgery, but your chance of living is greatly increased if you let me operate.
It's just going to be you two in there.
Yes?
No. I need to have at least one white doctor in that operating room so you don't kill me on the table. No offense.
No offense. Did he just say no offense? Shut up.
Yeah.
I need O'Malley.
We're about to go into surgery.
I need O'Malley.
You okay, Dr. Bailey?
Don't cross me.
I wasn't crossing you.
I'm rising above. I'm rising above and do not want to be crossed while I'm busy rising. I have to operate on a white supremacist, and he has requested a white doctor to watch me to make sure that I don't kill his crazy white behind. Now, I need O'Malley. Can I have him or not?
Yeah, O'Malley, go with Dr. Bailey. Yes, sir.
Get him to sign the consent, then have him anesthetized and ready.
Dr. Bailey, you're well within your rights to pass this on to somebody else.
Well, that would make me like him. I'm not like him.
So television creatives try to portray the trials, tribulations, and triumphs of marginalized people on doctor shows. I love Dr. Bailey.
Plans, please.
Ooh.
Can't operate.
Ooh, it's not stopping.
I won't
Hold on. I love Dr. Bailey, and I've loved her since college. She's smart, she's witty, she doesn't suffer fools, and she cares. Grey's fans have watched her go from chief resident to chief of the hospital, dealing with everything from racism to an active shooter to divorce to hospital merger to COVID, often encountering having some of those negative stereotypes thrust upon her and having to push through and excel nonetheless. We try to tell stories of people who exist in the world and the things that they experience. With certain shows, like doctor shows, there's often a drive to show audiences things they could never come across, like someone with a tree stuck in them, and issues they never thought about, like a doctor diagnosing an Asian patient's diverticulitis as appendicitis because he wasn't aware that diverticulitis is more prominent in the Asian population. And that even though Dr. Hunt on Grey's Anatomy diagnosed his patient to the best of his ability, his diagnosis came through a white lens, and therefore he needs to change the protocol. That's what he needs to do. Grey's was having a teachable moment. That's what the writers were aiming for, where they told the audience members something they likely didn't know, possibly empowered Asian viewers to ask for this consideration from their doctors if they ever present with symptoms that seem like appendicitis, and reminded the medical professionals in their viewership that they can never stop reading and learning and continuing to make a difference across the spectrum of patients that they encounter. We as writers and creatives try to represent you, but we're also here to entertain and to share information, usually in the most palatable way possible. Once our work is out there, it's being negotiated with and interpreted by audiences in ways that we cannot control, but that you may encounter. You try your best, we try our best, and hopefully it makes for an entertained and more knowledgeable audience. We in the entertainment industry know that our work is not done when it comes to representation, and we're going to continue trying to move forward. Thank you.
We're clapping, but you can't hear us because we were muted. Thank you so much.
Share.
So if anyone has any questions, there's one in the chat already, but and if anyone on the Zoom wants to speak up and ask a question, just raise your little hand and I'll let you speak. But one of the questions was just about the timeline of this new model of shows about doctors and representations, and when did that more nuanced approach to introducing what physicians do and what our day-to-day is like and who we are as people, was Shonda Rhimes one of the first to do that, or had that been happening in different shows before that? I think you're muted.
There you go. So no, she wasn't, but I think she, upped the drama on what could happen in a hospital for sure. But I would say it seemed like the 80s and 90s were the beginning of a more expansive look at doctors in doctor shows. Kind of, having having ER, having Chicago Hope, where these doctors were dealing with a lot more like psychosocial things, with being more involved in their personal lives, even comedy wise. A little later with the show Scrubs, it was doctors, but you were like hearing about their internal ruminations and things going on with them in that way. But Shonda Rhimes, I think, took it to a whole other level, especially with the residents of it all. And now, because of the longevity of her show, we've seen them go from residents to like experts in their different fields, which is usually not, we're usually not following them long enough to see this, from getting married, having children, balancing those responsibilities. She's just had a show long enough to be able to walk us through all of that while keeping it very dramatic. There was a live shooting in that hospital. I think there's been like a bombing. There was a plane crash. Like, she's taken us all on a very emotional roller coaster when it comes to doctors.
I just want to give the audience a chance to ask a question if you have any, and if not, then I will pipe up with a question, but I'm going to give you guys a chance. Okay. A question I had as we kind of near toward the end of the talk is going the other way, not only interacting with patients, because we know that our patients are viewing these shows just like we are, and we may have a little bit more realistic perspective of the feasibility of an ectopic pregnancy on someone's liver, which happened a couple weeks ago on Grey's Anatomy. But when we're interacting with our coworkers or other healthcare professionals, and how do we mirror what, or how do we kind of let art imitate what we should do, or should we be the ones that are kind of setting the expectation of what is realistic, knowing that it's not just our patients that are interacting with us, but we may, as minorities, be one of the few people that they know in a professional light, outside of who they see on television. And what did the executives at, speaking to other, people at the top of their license, as it were, like, what were their impressions about how they interacted with their other non-Black executives when trying to advocate for this more nuanced representation? Because it seems like it would be relevant to doctor relationships, as an analogy.
Yeah, it seemed like they viewed it very much as a negotiation. Like, these are the things that I'm going to push for. These are the things I'm not going to push for right now. And I would assume that's kind of just how you have to behave in life, because sometimes it's like, what are your top priorities that you want to get across? So for some shows, I think at the beginnings of having these more diverse casts, there might not have been much of a conversation about what it meant to be Black and a doctor, right? Like, it's just like you had a doctor, maybe they had a very similar storyline to everyone else. And that's not to say your Black character should only be talking about their Blackness, or that's the only thing that they deal with in the day. But that does have some sort of influence on how other people are receiving you, how other people are interacting with you. So as we've diversified the writer's room, I think those stories come into play a lot more, because they are recognizing that that would be a part of that person's life. So what was really cool, I think, with Bailey at the beginning was that that would come up every once in a while, where she's like, I fully recognize what the body in which I live as I do my job. And this doesn't take away from my ability to do my job. But I know that this is also something that I have to keep in the back of my mind as a potential reason why you're interacting with me in this way. And in a recent episode of Grey's, you had, they have all of the doctors basically working in the COVID wing. So I think the head of ortho is an Asian doctor, and a patient came in and they were like, I don't want you to treat me. They were like, where are you from? And he purposefully was like, I'm from New York, and then just like kept it moving. And then one of the residents was like, what that person was implying. And he said, I know what they're implying, but I'm here to do my job. and I'm not going to try to get into this with them. So acknowledging that those things exist, but that, you know, all of you still have a job that you need to do and a certain level of professionalism, but like, when are the times, where are the windows where you can bring up those subjects? I think we are always trying to navigate that, and that executives do the same thing, and that writers do the same things, where it's like, okay, what is this thing that I can fight for, and how do I want to go about it in a way that is very planned and and in a negotiation that they will hopefully work. Ooh, okay, someone put in a question in the box.
There is a question in the chat. I'm gonna let you read that. We have a something
Yeah.
I'm just gonna respond to really.
So the question is, how as a creative do you balance writing scenes that have social impact influence that are seen by audiences as authentic and not forced as or perceived as political? That's a great question. I think one of the great things about being a writer in a writer's room is having a group of people who usually all have different points of view. And by having conversations about that topic within the room, you're usually getting to hear how different people would respond in real life, and then putting that into the script. Like, even though, you know, we get Hollywood gets categorized as a liberal mecca, even if we all might be on the same like political side, it doesn't mean we all have the same exact thought about how to go about something or the same feelings. And so sometimes, you know, when you have an instance where someone's like, I want to say this like politically incorrect thing, I'm always someone who wants to hear what that thing is, because we can give it to a character and have them express it and let us have a real conversation that I think is representative of the country, representative of our audience. And yes, we, you know, television tends to sometimes wrap things up in a nice bow that I wish we could do the same thing with our country all the time. But at least starting those conversations and planting those seeds of like, here are different ways to think about something. And sometimes I walk out of it being like, oh, I never thought about X thing this way. This is really interesting. And I think if I find it interesting, I'm sure other people out there will as well. But utilizing the people that you have in the room that have different points of view, and then getting to kind of graft those onto characters is always really gratifying, and I hope sparks conversation.
And it seems like, just as you mentioned, as writers' rooms have become more diverse and there are different perspectives, even of, you know, even among a group of liberals, as it were, or a group of minorities, there are different ways to approach these topics, and that same principle stands in, you know, whatever industry you want to substitute, including in medicine, whether it's physician teams, whether it's you know, medical school classes. And so I think that that's an important lesson that hopefully the rest of the audience was able to latch on to. If there are no other questions, and I want to give you guys another opportunity to comment or ask a question, but I think that this has been, I think that this is from Susie, one of the other OBGYN residents. I think that what is even perceived as political depends on who you are versus everyday lived experience that's familiar to a viewer.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I like, at this point, there's a reason the saying is the personal is political. You know, a lot of our lives are tied up into what's happening in politics and vice versa. So those conversations are going to happen. And TV, I think, is a great place. Sometimes I'll watch an episode of television and I'm like, oh, this is how I'm going to handle this the next time this comes out. I'm just going to steal this dialogue from this character. And we're hopefully expanding ideas, but also like, giving you some emotional catharsis.
Well, I want to say thanks again to Dr. Hamilton and to everyone for hanging on through this afternoon and participating in the discussion. This lecture is going to be posted on our YouTube page so that if your classmates or co-residents weren't able to join, they can watch it later. We'll let you know when that is posted. Thank you so much, Nikita. I look forward to the next time we can chat at Christmas in person and not on Zoom.
Yes.
I do want to put a plug in for our lecture survey that's going to go live in about 1 minute. If you're on campus, you cannot get to this because it's a Google form, but we'll ask you to fill it out once you get off the server. Thank you everybody so much for your time. Thanks, Dr. Hamilton, for your time.
Thank you for
And
having me.
we will see you all back in February for the next lecture. Be safe and wear your mask. Bye.
Bye.